the weather. His chivalry suddenly knew no bounds. Poor sweet Tommy, leaning out the window of his car, pleading and begging, then truly demanded to get back in his car. Such a good guy, that Tommy. That's what everyone would say. You worried him sick, Nancy, they scold. You and your stubbornness. What were you trying to prove, storming off like that? So very unladylike, and so very crass. Why, you're darn lucky that a boy like Tommy even gave you a chance to come back. How could anyone, after what he did to me, taking me out there in this weather, what a dipstick, and then tell me that he was leaving me for Sue after we'd been going steady since high school? Sue, I couldn't believe it, couldn't imagine what would make him draw me to go out with a lump skag like Sue. Well, I suppose the boys called her Stack Sue for a reason. But still, and then he had the very nerve to tell me he'd reconsider if I go all the way with him right then and there. All this just 2 weeks before Christmas, when I thought, well, we had been together since junior year and had been out of high school for a year by then. He invited me to spend Christmas with him and his family, and I thought, scratch all that. I was harboring a ton of hatred towards Tommy, and he deserved every bit of it. It had been chilly when I stomped out of his car and started walking home. The wind was brisk and the snow was swirling lightly as I stamped down the road. Tommy had driven alongside me until I cut across Bushweed Park, and he couldn't follow me anymore. My shortcut through Bushweed Park had been the first of my problems. See, when Tommy picked me up, I thought we were going to the movies. They were doing a late showing of the new Rock Hudson film, and I put on my favorite dress, nicest stockings, and best pumps. I had a hat and a coat, of course, but I had not planned on hiking across town just to get back home. I was already shivering when my heels skidded along a patch of ice. I crashed to the ground when the snow was collecting far more quickly than I had thought. Frustrated, I picked myself back up. My left stocking was torn and the pumps now had scuffs on them, not to mention the pebbles that embedded in my palm. Cursing Tommy, I trudged toward the park. It was dim, but not dark. The lampposts cast beams across the path. I thought maybe Tommy would drive to the other side of the park and wait for me there, so I could crowd across the path, headed west, intent on getting back to the street and going around where he might have parked. The wind howled, and the snow grew thicker, and my coat was getting heavier and heavier as it absorbed the melted flakes. Soon, I was shivering even worse. My hair was wet, my clothes were wet, even my toes were wet as melted snow trickled down my leg and into my shoes. When I finally got through the park, the world lightened mercifully with the much brighter streetlights. I was just off Main Street, and then the businesses were closed for the night. Their lights helped guide me towards residential areas so I could finish my walk home. It worsened as I walked down Main Street. Suddenly, the flakes were thicker, and the wind was stronger, enough to blow my hat off my head. I held it down desperately, serving only to numb my fingers. The snow was getting deeper and deeper, creeping over the edge of my pumps and making my feet slide in my shoes. I looked around, hoping wildly that perhaps someone was in one of those shops and would be driving by, but the world was deserted. And then, just like that, the world was dark. I blinked rapidly and pinched my skin with shaking fingertips. Once I determined I hadn't passed out from the cold or fallen into the snowbank, I reasoned that the power must have gone out. I would find out later that it was a town-wide, that the snow had gotten so heavy so quickly that some major lines had broken down, but at that moment I had no idea what to think. All I knew was that it was cold and wet, and it was so dark I couldn't even see 3 feet ahead. Damn Tommy. It wasn't his fault that the power went out, but I was going to blame him all the same. With my hands extended in front of me and my heart beating wildly, I tried to follow where I knew the sidewalk was. My hat flew off and the snow tangled my hair, making it stick to my scalp. I fell again at the end of the street, not realizing the curb was ending and that I was crossing the residential area. As I collected myself off the ground again, I sighed in relief. If I had made it down Main Street, that meant I had fallen in the intersection with Popular Street. If I kept walking completely straight, the first driveway I would come across would have been my best friend, Martha Benson's house. She would let me in, I was sure of it, and let me call my parents sister that I was okay. It was easier said than done. The snow was freezing on the ground, and the road was so slick that I fell twice more before reaching the other side of the street. Trembling wildly, I could see the dim outline of the hedges and blackness that had been at the beginning of their driveway. Moving as quickly as I could, I kept myself from slipping on the walk and managed to stumble up to the front steps. I rang the bell out of habit, but of course there was no sound, shaking as I knocked the door. A few seconds went past, then a minute. My fingers were painfully cold, and I flexed them as I waited. My heart sank, and I knocked out again. "Martha, Miss Benson, please let me in," I shouted desperately, though I was doubtful that anyone would hear me above the wind. Of course, there was no answer. Tears welled up in my eyes, freezing to my eyelashes, blurring what little vision I had. My teeth chattered, perhaps from the cold, perhaps from the nerves, or perhaps from the thoughts of the dark of the night that began to creep in my mind. I started pounding on the door. "Please, is anyone home? Please help me." The night was silent aside from the hiss and the roar of the wind, the banging of my fists, and the wet sounds of terror and frustration that escaped my throat. I knocked until my knuckles were bruised, until my hands were numb, until I couldn't unfurl my fist. I was sobbing, certain I was going to die frozen solid on the Benson's doorstep, when the door flung open. I nearly fell into the house, but a strong set of arms caught me as I yelped in surprise. "Nancy Parker, is that you?" "May I please come in?" I said weakly. The strong arms guided me into the house, swinging the door shut behind me. A candle was lit on a nearby table. A flashlight next to it pointed at the ceiling. The room was blissfully warmed, and I turned to see who my savior was. My mouth dropped open for a moment. I almost forgot how cold it was. Standing next to the door was Bruce Benson, Martha's older brother. The last time I had seen Bruce, he had been breaking my sister Donna's heart as he left for boot camp. I remembered watching Bruce and Donna talk on the porch, hidden behind the curtains of the living room window. I never told Donna, but I had loved Bruce as much as she had it. He was older, sure, but he had always been funny and sweet. I knew Donna's heart was breaking, but I couldn't help staring at him, wishing he would come home, hoping that when he did, he'd finally notice me. Bruce had looked so mature in his uniform, so handsome. The man standing in front of me now was not the same Bruce I had remembered. I was 19, the same age as he was when he first left, and he was now a full-fledged man. His arms didn't seem too long for his body anymore. His face had grown into his eyes. There was this faint scarring on his cheek that was jagged ridges that had faded to smooth lines. They were noticeable, but only served to enhance the ruggedness of his face. His hair was neatly groomed, his shoulders broad, muscles, and his eyes, oh, his eyes. Bruce had left with innocent hope of a young man and returned with eyes that reflected horrors I wouldn't wish to know. They should have terrified me, those eyes, and they were much colder than the snow dripping down my spine, but they didn't. More than anything, they intrigued me. I didn't want to know what he had seen. I simply wanted to know who he was now. So much of him has changed. His face was as handsome as it could, but hard, far more stern and serious than it should have been for a man of 23. Behind it, though, I could see Bruce. I could see the ghost of laughter on his face, the easy smile that he used to have when flashing at my sister, and that made jealousy course through my heart. He was still there somewhere, but I had to see for myself. He stared at me as I stood in front of the hall, shivering and dripping cold snow from my hems of the soaked clothing. "Can I take your coat?" he asked, almost absurdly polite. My teeth chattered as a noise that could have been a laugh or a sob burst in my throat. "Oh, geez," he muttered. "Come on in. I'm sure Martha wouldn't mind if you borrowed some of the dry clothes." He gestured to me to go to Martha's room. wasn't removing my clothing out of pity. I drew a deep breath and cleared my throat. Bruce, I hate to impose, but I need some help. He opened the door tentatively. I was still decent, and he opened the door the rest of the way. What's the trouble? My lips were shaking as violently as the rest of me, and I'm sure if my body was capable of producing warmth at that moment, I would have blushed. I can't undo my dress. My hands won't work, and I'm so cold. He hesitated, then stepped into the room with a strange, staggered stride. He was holding a stack of blankets and towels, but quickly put them on the dresser before motioning to turn to me. With professional quickness, he undid the dress and stepped back. I'll stay here in case you need some more help. I won't look. You'll catch pneumonia if you don't warm up, he said frankly. Relax, Nance. I won't peek. Pointedly, he covered his vision with his hands. Mortified, I stared at him, my mouth half open. He was going to stay there while I undressed. I almost protested, almost insisted that he leave the room, but he was right. There was a good chance I'd need more help. I kept a nervous eye on him, hesitating before letting my dress drop to the floor with a sloppy splat. My slip came off easily, although it was soaked and stuck to my skin. I tried to undo my garters for my stockings, but again couldn't get my fingers to function. Bruce, I'm so sorry, I whispered. I need more help. He turned to the dresser, grabbing a blanket and passing it to me before fully uncovering his eyes. I wrapped it around me, though the idea of preserving modesty was laughable at the moment, and asked him to do my garters. Bruce was a perfect gentleman, his fingers barely grazing my clammy skin as he undid the garters, and his eyes focusing only what he was doing. I then pressed the blanket against my chest and around my back, turned around, and asked if he could unhook my bra. It was only at that point where Bruce shook a bit. I felt his fingers tremble as he stood behind me, deftly undoing the clasp. His hands were warm, or at least I was so cold that even they felt like they were scorching. The tips of his fingers grazed my back, and it took everything in me not to shiver, though I suppose a shiver would be more appropriate. After all, Bruce wouldn't have been able to tell which shivers were due to the cold and which were because his hands were touching my bare skin. Once it was done, he stepped away quickly and took 2 limping steps towards the door. Anything else? He said quietly. I shook my head. Take what you need. I don't think Martha would mind. He picked up the clothing I had already removed and left closing the door quickly behind him. I tried not to think of my silly crush on Bruce and let the blanket fall so I could remove my garter belt, stockings, and panties. I squeezed my soaking hair with one of the towels and wiped every inch of myself from head to toe as I could. I was lucky enough to find a nightgown that was much too large for Martha. It was brand new, perhaps a gift from her grandmother. While it was short-sleeved and covered in frilly, lacy nonsense, it covered me. I found a dressing gown hanging in her closet and wrapped it around me gratefully, and held slippers that were only slightly tight. I was still chilled, but the shivering had subsided quite a bit by drying off. There was a mirror above Martha's dresser. I wasn't sure if the dim lighting in the room helped or hindered, but the face staring back at me was frightful. I sniffed, torn between my laughter and tears, and turned away. Nothing looked especially pretty, but had to be an improvement from the swamp monster that appeared at the door. Shaking my head, I chastened myself. I was not there to flirt with Bruce. I was not supposed to be there at all. I picked up on the rest of my wet clothing, opened the door. From the hall in the living room, I could see flickering firelight and hear the crackle of the dry wood popping. I brought the clothes rack into the living room and called Bruce. We can hang your things to dry nearby. The room was thick with the scent of smoke and wood. A merry fire roared beneath the mantel dressed with evergreen garlands and candles. A photo of Miss Benson tucked between the branches. In the corner, the fresh pine tree Miss Benson insisted every year was neatly decorated, and a few wrap boxes were already waiting beneath the tree. It was almost cozy, almost festive, almost a perfect daydream of a situation. Minus the fact that it was freezing cold swamp monster, of course. Bruce had already hung my dress, coat, and slipped on the drying rack near the fire. I could have been a little bit more embarrassed that my underthings were about to be in display in front of him, but Considering he removed some of them from me, it seemed silly to worry. As I used the light from the flashlight to finish hanging my clothes, he busied himself at the fireplace, sparking shooting up as he rustled the wood with the iron poker. There was a glorious warming emanating from the fire, and once I was done, he ushered me onto the couch, where he had even more blankets waiting. I buried myself beneath 3 of them, tucking my knees to my chest and drawing the fabric up to my chin. Once I was settled, Bruce sat beside me on the couch, stiffly lowering himself into the cushions. We sat quietly, and the warmth of the fire began to return some life into my frigid bones. He cleared his throat finally. I hate to intrude at all, but do you want to explain to me what the hell just happened? I snorted a bit, biting my lip. Well, I don't have a boyfriend anymore. A giggle burst in my throat, then another, and then I was cackling madly as I hugged the blankets around me. Bruce was looking at me like I was from another planet. Slowly, I regained my composure. My boyfriend, Tommy. We were on a date. Seems like a pretty lame date, he said. I snorted. He was supposed to take me to the movies. He responded. And he, what, took you to the middle of the field and left you there? I shook my head. He took me to the hill near Bushweed Park. Bruce looked amused. The hill, huh? Didn't they used to call that the neck in the woods? I muttered, yeah. I thought he might laugh, but his face was solemn. I have a feeling he didn't want to be there, he said gently. He said he was going to break up with me unless well, I hope he's happy with his stupid slag, Sue. Sue, he asked, doubted. That nickname was only ever a mean thing for people said about her. Far as I know, she never even kissed a boy. How would you know? I asked. Things change. It wasn't meant to be a dig, but it came out that way. He smiled tightly. Suppose I wouldn't, he said after a moment. I bit my lip, mentally kicking myself for being rude. Well, I said softly, that's what happened. I didn't want him to drive me home. So you got out of the car and walked across town in the snowstorm? He asked flatly. I didn't say it was a good idea. It was a terrible idea, he said bluntly. You could have died. The frankness might have just been how Bruce was now, or it might have been a dig back at my unintentional one. Either way, it hurt, and either way, I wasn't about to tell him that. I need to call my mother, I said, standing up. Hate to break it to you, but the lines are down. I turned to him, my mouth half open. But how will I get home? I asked dumbly. He raised his eyebrows. I don't know, Nance. I think you're stuck here. My mother's going to worry. My father will be furious. I have to get home. He shook his head. Not a chance. Maybe you can sort something out in the morning, but I can't drive, and there's no cabs running right now. Nothing. Even if there was, how would you reach him? Phones are out too. I sat slowly back down, pulling the blankets over me as I stared into the fire. All they knew was that I had gone out with Tommy, and that we were planning to do the movies. What would they think that I didn't come home? For that matter, what would Tommy do? For all he knew, I was trapped in Bushweed Park. Would he go tell my parents and tell them that I'd stormed off and was missing? Or would he just go home? Would he just see that stupid Sue? And what about when the word got out that I'd spent the night at the Bensons with only Bruce home? Donna would be scandalized, never mind the circumstances. Even Martha might be suspicious. The neighbors would talk. I simply had to get home. My house wasn't especially close to the Bensons, but it wasn't far either. Maybe a 15-minute walk. In normal weather, and Martha's slippers were only slightly tight on me. Perhaps she had a pair of boots I could borrow. Then if Bruce would lend me a coat, well, and a pair of pants, and a hat. I voiced my plan to Bruce, who shook his head. Worse, you might fall. You wouldn't survive a night out there with a broken leg. You could walk me home, stay the night hours, and my dad can bring you back in the morning. A sharp bark of laughter told me I was asking too much, which I certainly was. I sighed, staring back into the fire, worry etched in every line of my face. Let me make sure I have this right. Bruce's voice was soft but serious. Your boyfriend said he was taking you to a movie but drove you to the neck in the woods and said he'd break up with you unless you went all the way with him. Otherwise, he was going with Sue. You jumped out of the car, lost him at the park, and then got stuck in the snowstorm imagination, I studied him, watching the firelight flick along the face. The light made his skin look warm, tanned, and golden, and red all at the same time, a fascinating blend of color that danced along his cheeks and jaw. I wanted to touch the spots that danced, the shadows playing along the scars. Not with my hands, of course. I want to touch the spots with my lips. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for part 2 of this nice erotic story. Well, make sure to like and subscribe. I'll see you guys next time.